We're on to section 5, and now I think you're going to really enjoy this particular section because it deals with text in the Book of Mormon and some of its issues and excitement, but also some of its anomalies. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the reoccurrence of stories, and there are a number of places in the Book of Mormon that story arcs or story narratives have been repeated, and they're exactly the same except for the names are different. And so that's fascinating when you look at them because you can see them side by side and see that they're the same. And one of these things is, of course, the Book of Ether, which is just a mini version of the Book of Mormon. And we can put this side by side and see that the same text in the Book of Mormon is in the Book of Ether. Then there's repeated type scenes. So these are smaller versions of this, so little examples that are repeated again and again in quite significant ways. Ether itself has a whole number of repetitions where the same story arc is used again and again and again in quick succession, so that's fascinating. 4, there's a number of repeated texts, so phrases that are repeated constantly, often in the same verse, so that's kind of interesting. And number 5, text redundancy. There's large passages that include a rambling, so this is indicative of an oratory production, but the idea that your same themes coming up and again because the person who is dictating is getting an idea and recycling it, something that wouldn't happen if you were writing something down. There's also some general redundancy, so a lot of contradictions, and then there's a lot of name repetition that we need to look at, and then a few other odd contradictions. And then the last one is an interesting one because we can see that some of the people that Joseph interacted with, particularly his scribes, influenced the text of the Book of Mormon. And that shouldn't happen, of course, but it's fascinating when it does. And it's really in interesting ways that relate to the person particularly. And so we can see how Joseph is managing the people around him as he is connecting with them and invoking the text of the Book of Mormon. Section 5, number 1, the Book of Ether. So the Book of Ether is a book within the Book of Mormon, towards the end of the Book of Mormon, but it's actually a record of the Jaredites, which came to the Americas 2,000 years before Christ and operated until about 600 years before Christ. So just predates that Lehi migration. And so the Book of Ether is short, 15 chapters, and it's mostly sermons. But there is a very fast history in the Book of Ether, and it progresses at a rapid pace. One of the interesting things about the Book of Ether is that it pretty much is a mirror of the Book of Mormon as a total. So it's like a smaller version, like a Cliff Notes or a Reader's Digest version of the Book of Mormon. And many of the things that happen in the Book of Mormon happen in the Book of Ether. And many of the same passages and scriptures and sermons and events and also language happen between the two. And so we're going to look at that right now. One of the fun things about the Book of Ether is you can go through the chapters and find verses that match verses in the Book of Mormon. And so you can do a bit of a correlation and you can see that a lot of the set themes add up, that they're similar. So if you stop these as I'm going through them, you can just look at them, and I've put corresponding verses from the Book of Mormon next to the Book of Ether. So you can see the language often is exactly word for the word, but more often that kind of theme and understanding. And this happens again and again and again. And the thing that's fascinating is it's going through the same material. Now, these civilizations should be at least 1,500 to 2,000 years apart, and yet they're having the same experiences, using the same language, using the same materials and tools, and looking at the same things the same ways. And the idea that they had the same language or the same phrases is suspect. And Ether is this rapid version of the Book of Mormon. And just like the Book of Mormon, it ends in terrible ways. And the lesson of the Book of Ether mirrors the whole of the Book of Mormon. The Book of Ether does have some differences from the Book of Mormon, which we'll cover shortly, but the overarching story arc, the narrative, the conclusion, the understanding of the people and what goes on with them are all the same. So, from a story level, the Book of Ether supports the Book of Mormon, but from a literary perspective, it downgrades it. Section 5, number 2, Ether repetitions. So we've already just talked about Ether being a mirror of the Book of Mormon and having that consistency with Book of Mormon. But we should also talk about how Ether internally plays out, because there are a number of things which are quite interesting. When you analyze the text of the Book of Ether, you notice some curious things. And one is that the narrative is very reoccurring. There are a number of narratives. One is that if you're a good king, that you might live to a good old age. But if you're a wicked king, you might be deposed, imprisoned, that often by your children, and then that in prison you were able to have children in your old age, and those children would then release you from prison and you would bestow the kingdom on them. So this story arc goes again and again and again, and it's got a number of elements, 3 or 4 elements, and either most of those stories fit 2 or 3 of those elements and just quick succession and repetition. This seems to be very odd, because you would think that somebody would learn pretty quickly that if you imprison somebody and let them have children, those children might come back and haunt you. So why wouldn't you just make it a bit more final? For some reason, the kings in the Book of Ether did not figure this out. The other narrative that plays out in the Book of Ether is this idea of prophets coming, multiple prophets who preach to the people of their destruction. Sometimes the people repent, sometimes the destruction happens and then the people repent. And so this is another common idea that gets cycled again and again, and it's a very similar narrative arc. And the final prophet that comes is this man called Ether, which the book is named after, who prophesies to the kings who are fighting under this kind of dual nation, that if they don't desist, that the Lord will utterly destroy them, and that's exactly what happens. And so again, we see the same arc and relation to the Book of Mormon as a whole. The other thing to know about the Book of Ether is that it feels like a bit of a store, like it's an afterthought to the whole of the Book of Mormon, that it's not meant to be there, or that it just is reiterating the same theme as the Book of Mormon. And so consequently, it doesn't get used very much, Ether, in modern day sermons, because the history part is very odd. But the sermon part is often the same as the Book of Mormon proper, and so there's no real need to reiterate it. Section 5, number 3, story repetition. Did you know that there are a number of stories in the Book of Mormon that are repeated? So they're exactly the same stories, and they appear multiple times in the Book of Mormon. It's curious, and it's really interesting, and let's have a look. King Noah in Mosiah chapter 11 and King Ripakash in Ether chapter 10 have the same story. So the story is slightly different lengths, but it has the same progression, same events, same wording. Righteous father, a son who did not keep the commandments, wives and concubines, heavy taxes, built spacious buildings and fine thrones, used fine workmanship, afflicted the people. The people rebelled against them, and they were eventually killed, and the supporters were driven out. Even some of the same language and phraseology is used in both of those texts, even though they're supposedly 1,500 years apart. The story of Sherem in Jacob chapter 7 and Korihor in Alma chapter 30 are also identical. They have different names, of course, but the same story arc. Antichrist preaches, leads away hearts, converses with high priest, denies prophecy, gets refuted, appeals to the Holy Spirit, asks for a sign, is warned not to tempt God, is struck down, confesses their deception, dies badly, and the people are converted. So that's 12 points that are the same, and here we are seeing them in this one story repeated twice. Ammon's Lamanite mission and Aaron's Lamanite mission, there are only actually 5 chapters apart, in Alma chapter 17 and Alma chapter 22, and yet they exhibit the same story arcs. They went to preach, seek to be servants of a Lamanite king. The Spirit directs them, asks if they believe in a God. The Great Spirit explained God created all things. Christ, the king, believed. They rehearsed the creation, the plan of redemption, expounded. The king prayed. The king faints. The wife is notified. The king rose. The household is converted. Multitudes gather together. Multitudes murmur. The king speaks. Alma and Ammon administer the people, and the king grants access for the gospel to be taught throughout the kingdom. So those are 19 points that are the same between those two stories. And here's another one, King Mosiah and Omni 1, and then King Mosiah, a grandson, and Mosiah 25 and 28. And this also has a very similar story arc to each other. It talks about the same characters, even the same names. So it's very fascinating that this is repeated in the Book of Mormon. These repeated stories indicate that there is some background understanding of what's going on. Section 5, number 4, repeated type scenes. So type scenes are examples that get used again and again and again, and just a few things that are changed so that it looks different, much like a template. And there are a number of these through the Book of Mormon that get used again and again and have very similar aspects, and so we're going to look at them in detail. Fled from a wicked king is a really interesting type scene that's used again and again in the Book of Mormon, in Nephi and Mosiah and in Ether, and it's just so fascinating because it shares all these great elements. We also see these similar themes like mourning and lamentation coming up in different parts of the Book of Mormon, but very, very similar phraseology. All manner of weapons of war is another type scene that comes up again and again. Lehi's dream and Alma's dream have exactly the same wording. Angelic appearances are very type scene. They come again and again in the Book of Mormon, and they follow a very similar pattern. Fleeing into the wilderness is another type scene which is used again and again. Fighting like dragons for wives and children against twice as many Lamanites. This is used 3 times in Mosiah 20, Alma 43, and Mormon 2. So it's really interesting that these type scenes are being used again. Being cast into prison is also a type scene that's used in a number of places in the Book of Mormon. And we see the same attributes of those stories being exhibited again and again. Pride of hearts, envying, strife, malice, those are phrases that are used again in quick succession. And then not punished for belief, it's also reiterated a number of times in very similar aspects. The idea of blotting somebody out or casting them out. Also the idea of using a javelin, it's used twice in a very similar kind of circumstance. And then gathering the people, to have a conference or a sermon preached. There's also a famine narrative that's used a couple of times. Pride cycles is an interesting one. We've already talked about pride cycles, but here it is in its text form being reiterated in multiple places in the same kind of ways. The idea that lost people are found, they recount their history, they have found records, they're translated. We talked about this one already in Omni and Mosiah. The same kind of issues coming up again and again. Here's another type scene about conspiracy to trick and bring into bondage that we see in Nephi and Alma and Helaman. And here we see some big repetition with this reason for the small plates that's being reiterated again and again and again and then again and again. And then also another one like rising generation, that they get corrupted, that they lose their way. And these repeated type scenes act as templates that can be worked off to create longer story arcs. Section 5, number 5, repeated text. So there are a number of places in the Book of Mormon where the author repeats what he's just said, sometimes in the same verse, sometimes in the same chapter, but it's just odd because, of course, if you were writing this down, you would not make that kind of a mistake. You would phrase it differently, or you would not repeat it completely the same. And another issue is that we're told that the plates are very sparse, that there's only a small amount of space, and it's difficult to engrave on them. So the idea that there should be these double ups is precarious. Here it is in First Nephi with accomplish the thing which he commanded, and reign of the kings and wars and contentions also in the first part of Nephi. We also have repeated passages of scripture. So Isaiah scriptures which are repeated in 2 Nephi 21 and in 2 Nephi 30, kept and preserved from generation to generation in 2 Nephi. Baptism of fire, tongues and angels in 2 Nephi 31. People have been destroyed in Mosiah 8, flattering, Mosiah 11, and prayers of the righteous, famine, pestilence, and the sword, and Alma 10. Conferred upon Helaman in Alma 63. Helaman and his sons, even down to the coming of Christ, and the Helaman heading. Repeated verses of scripture again, Micah 5 and 3 Nephi 20 and in 3 Nephi 21. And we're called Laman Nephites, Jacobites, Josephites, and 4 Nephi 1. Here's some more in Mormon and in Ether, both with a full account of wickedness and abominations and decrees of God, serving God and be swept off, and the Gentiles mock, not mighty in writing. And another in Moroni 1, that kind of idea of not having supposed to have written anymore. So these are really indicative of an oral production. The idea that someone's speaking and then either gets interrupted or things change and then the same phrase that is on their mind is repeated. These are not the kind of things that you would see if somebody was writing something down, because of course if they were writing it, they'd see that they had written that and they would change it, or there wouldn't be that redundancy in the text, that repetition. So it's really indicative of a oral production, and these things show that whoever is doing it, which is likely Joseph because he's dictating it, is improvising on the fly at the time. Section 5, number 6, omissions or constrained record. With all of these repetitions that we have in the Book of Mormon, it's surprising that there are things that the Book of Mormon mentions that are missing, things that aren't talked about because there's not enough space, or there's not enough time, or they're too sacred. And this happens throughout the Book of Mormon whenever there's a need to expand, but no ability to expand. So let's go through that quickly. So this happens right off the bat in the first part of Nephi, and this is kind of understandable because this is the replacement text, but there's another number of references to this not being a full account, that this is not a history, this is a spiritual witness, and so there's lots of things left out of the record. But there's also these opportunities where it says that there's so much going on that we cannot write them all, or that what's been beheld is too great for man, so they're not going to write them down, or that because they're not mighty in writing, they can't adequately describe everything that's going on, or that what's already been written is enough. And this continues into Mosiah, because we're told also that there are lots of things not written in this book. And in Helaman, we're told only 100th part of the proceedings of the people are written, or that what's happened can't be written, or in Jesus' case, it's too sacred to be written, or that it's just impossible to describe these things. And this goes on and on, throughout the Book of Mormon, that there's things missing, that if there was enough space or enough time or enough righteousness, that you would be able to see all of these things and read them. And in the Book of Ether, because it's an abridgment, there's also this kind of lack, this idea that there's only a partial account. And here's that same idea again, that the 100th part cannot be written. So we see that there's a lot of things missing from the Book of Mormon, things that are apparently incredibly sacred, incredibly powerful and amazing, but they're not included for whatever reason. And yet we have all these repetitions that suggest that we've got a lot of stuff twice or three times when we could be using that valuable space or valuable time to be including the information which is not there. Section 5, number 7. Redundancy in the text. So along with this repetition that is existing in the Book of Mormon and those omissions, we have a lot of redundancy. So a lot of incoherent statements or repetitive nature type rambles that suggest that the person is speaking off the cuff, but also that this is not very planned sometimes, and there's a lot there that could be cut down easily and and got rid of. So here are some good examples in Nephi of just this idea of repetitive ideas again and again in the text that are repetitions, but they're also, really odd in the sense that they, just cover the same ground again and again, which is great for a repetition, of course, but not very great for a coherent reading. And so while we don't have this repetitive phraseology, we do have these repetitive ideas that just go again around and around and around, where they could be easily shortened. And this is more evidence of an oratory production, not a written down text which is just being read back to a scribe. And some of this redundancy is really painful, including idea of years. So 3 Nephi 2:4 is a good example. And thus did pass away the 96th year, and also the 97th year, and also the 98th year, and also the 99th year. So that idea of just saying the same thing over and over again, where they could have easily said, and 5 years passed away. So just that constant kind of oratory rereading is really interesting. Even Christ in 3 Nephi has the same kind of repetitive rambling, which is indicative throughout the Book of Mormon, which suggests it's not really Christ. So this redundancy happens throughout the Book of Mormon, and it just seems to be very indicative of the text, of the type of production that it is, and particularly the person doing it. Section 5, number 8, 19th century phrases. So throughout the Book of Mormon, we've shown you these repetitions that are happening, and there are also phrases that are repeated often that make the backbone of the Book of Mormon. And a lot of these are 19th century phrases, so things that are common to 19th century time, and also things that are common to maybe the Bible that just end up in lots of places in the Book of Mormon, and we're going to show you this. So the most common phrase in the Book of Mormon is the phrase, "and it came to pass that," which features 1,449 times, which is 5% of the words of the Book of Mormon. That's 8,700 words, enough for 12 additional sermons if that phrase wasn't used and we used the same space. But there are also a number of other phrases that come up through the Book of Mormon in various verses that are very interesting and that they're very unique. And so I've made a list here that you can look at. And what's fascinating about these phrases is that when you put them into Google Ngrams, which is an algorithm that rates it against literature, you can see that those particular phrases score very high in terms of the time frame that the Book of Mormon was being written. So they're high in their usage. So these are phrases which are in common understanding, particularly in 19th century America. And you can see that those particular phrases were in high use at that particular time, and that you can see that over time those things have gone down in their use. So here are a list of phrases which aren't biblical phrases, but they're unique kind of combinations of words. And when you test them against the Google Ngram, you see that they come up, multiple times at, significant spaces that are close to the Book of Mormon publication. So I've gone through and just showed you the amount of occurrences and there's the significant use. And there are lots of these phrases, and they're really interesting words and expressions that are only 19th century expressions. And this is the kind of stuff that Richard Bushman was alluding to when he's saying that you can Google phrases from the Book of Mormon and find them in 19th century literature. And this is the reason. So all of these examples seem to indicate that the vernacular that was used in 19th century early America was transferred into the Book of Mormon by the people that were producing the Book of Mormon. Section 5, number 9, names. Book of Mormon contains a lot of names, a lot of unique names, 337 to be exact. And so this is one of those things that is said to be quite sophisticated about the Book of Mormon, that it has a lot of names. So there are a few issues, and we should just have a look at them quickly. One of the things you notice when you group the Book of Mormon names together and start to kind of order them is that you can see some patterns. One is that you can see a lot of biblical names that appear in the Book of Mormon, which is not unusual, and certainly not unusual for the 19th century, because lots of people name their children after biblical characters, still do today. But then with those examples, you start to see some derivatives, some things that you can, that are mix and match, and then also some extensions. And so lots of the Book of Mormon names start to be less sophisticated in the sense that there are kind of core names, and then there are add-ons to those names. And this is, of course, what we do today with lots of names, so it's not unusual. But it does seem to take away from that sophistication that is the first glance of names in the Book of Mormon. The other thing you notice is, of course, there are very few female names, and we covered this a lot in the chapter on patriarchy, but there are only 6 women's names in the Book of Mormon and only 3 women named characters in the Book of Mormon, whereas there are hundreds of men's names. And so that's an issue, because oftentimes women are only referred to in their reference to men, so daughters, so on. One other oddity of the names in the Book of Mormon is that they often appear only once, or in a very, very small part of the Book of Mormon. Some of that is understandable because it's a timeline and there's some rapid advancement, which means you're on to the next story. But it also suggests that they're kind of random or throwaway names that are just put in as placeholders rather than as characters and as fleshing out of the story.
Section 5, number 10. Odd contradictions. There are a number of stories in the Book of Mormon which seem to direct you down one path, and then another story that seems to direct you in the exact opposite path. And so there's some of those things which are very odd and we should explore. So the first odd contradiction is the migration northward. So in Alma 50, there's a story about this guy called Morianton, and he's going to escape and take his city northward. And this is a really big problem. And so the army sent out to stop him. But only a few years later, there's another person, Hagoth, who takes ships to the north, and that's not a problem whatsoever. Another odd story is that the Nephites implement democracy, an idea that of elected officials, and so they have chief judges to replace kings. But then the chief judges act like kings. Their sons take on the role of the chief judge after them. So it's like a kind of a lineage thing, just like kings. So it seems that they've swapped one set of kings for another set of kings. Another oddity is that in Ether, there's a real idea of the seer stones, and they're used to interpret these languages. But when Mosiah gets these jaredite plates, for some reason he already has some seer stones. So they're the same seer stones, or they're different. So the provenance is slightly odd. It could be that this provenance was actually explained in the Book of Lehi, and it's just not managed to get to the replacement text, which means that it never arrives in the idea. But these seer stones are very important. They're talked about again and again. The end of the Book of Mormon is also odd. It seems to have supposed to have ended with Mormon the prophet. Moroni says that there's no more ore and he can't do anything more. But then suddenly we have the whole of Ether, and then we have more scripture from Moroni without any explanation of where this extra ore comes from. So the Book of Ether and the Book of Moroni seem to be a tack-on to the whole hilarity of the Book of Mormon. Mormon's letters to Moroni are also very odd, because it's in a time of chaos when civilization is breaking down, and they seem to have no friends. Yet the idea of sending a letter and receiving a letter still seems to be intact. And also some of the details of the letters are really odd, because there's no mention of anybody else, no family that they're missing or worried about. So it seems that the letters are there for a purpose, but they're not really about the relationship between Mormon and Moroni.
Section 5, number 11, corrections. So the Book of Mormon was produced as an oratory production, which means that it was done as a dictation with Joseph speaking and then a scribe writing down. And as far as we're aware, he did this all in one continuous motion. There was no reading back and corrections, or at least very few in the original manuscript, and we only have a small proportion of that. But there were corrections done in the text at the time, and so some of those are very apparent, and we are going to go have a look at them now. There is a significant amount of immediate clarification and correction in the text. So as Joseph is speaking, there's a correction, usually by the words or the, or in other words, or being interpreted. So there's a double up of the text, which is a problem. But there's also that immediate kind of re-correcting of what has just been said. And some of these are very significant, and some of them are, you can easily gloss over. Now, this doesn't seem to be something that you would do if you were writing this down, because if you were just reading something that had been written down, people will have made corrections already in the text. But the fact that you get these really interesting oratory corrections is a feature of this type of production. So these are all over the Book of Mormon, but here's one from Mosiah, and they were called the Church of God or the Church of Christ. So there's an immediate correction there, or clarification. In Alma 10:15, I said I never had known so much of these things, but behold, I mistake, for I had seen much of the mysteries and his marvelous power. And these go on, or they buried their weapons of peace, or they buried their weapons of war for peace. And so these corrections are happening in the moment as they're being spoken. And here's a bit of a list that shows that this is throughout the Book of Mormon in lots of different ways, and there's lots of little corrections and clarifications to the text as it's being delivered. And they range right through the Book of Mormon. And you see these same textual phrases, or in other words, for I mean, and more especially, that give a understanding that the person who's speaking is able to correct what has just been said because it doesn't sound quite right, or it isn't quite correct. But if you were writing this down, of course, you would correct that in the moment, and you would make it right as you speak. Section 5, Scribes. Joseph had a number of people that he dictated the Book of Mormon to, and those were significant people to him, and they made a significant difference to the text. In fact, sometimes it seems like the text was changed because of their input, and we'll have a look. When Joseph began dictating the Book of Mormon again in March of 1829, his first scribe was Emma Smith, his wife, and she and Joseph had just gone through a traumatic experience of losing their first child, Alvin. And so soon into the dictation, there's a passage in Mosiah that directly relates to children, particularly infant children, who have been lost by nature or been lost during childbirth. And so Emma got a lot of comfort from this. Martin Harris made a big impact on the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, and he may have influenced the Book of Mormon text in some very significant ways. One specifically was the idea that the text of the Book of Mormon was Reformed Egyptian, something that was unknown to scholars because he had been the one who had taken characters to Professor Anthon for authentication. Martin scribed for him in 1829 for a small, brief period, and one of the things that the Book of Mormon text says then is that if you borrow anything, you should return it, probably alluding to the 116 lost pages. While scribing, the Book of Mormon said that the people should take care of the poor, and Joseph and Emma were very poor at this stage. And in reverse, the text of the Book of Mormon might have influenced Martin Harris to talk to Joseph about some of these words about eternal torment and eternal damnation, which were in the Book of Mormon. And Joseph got a revelation that that was just a trick of God to persuade people. Joseph also got a revelation that Martin Harris should put his money behind the Book of Mormon for its printing. Oliver Cowdery was the Book of Mormon's main scribe, and there are a number of instances where he influenced the text. The first one is where he wanted to be the translator himself, and yet he wasn't allowed to, and he was given command through the Book of Mormon that this was a special job for a special person, Joseph Smith. It's possible that Oliver influenced the idea that Christ would visit the Americas, which made a big impact on the Book of Mormon. Oliver may have also given the idea that Freemasonry or secret combinations was the downfall of the Jaredite nation. David Whitmer and his family seem to have influenced Joseph Smith to include anti-Catholic material in the beginning part of the Book of Mormon. And several things correlate between the Book of Mormon and the early Doctrine and Covenants. And Oliver, David, and Martin may have influenced the Book of Mormon to include an idea of 3 witnesses. And then they became those 3 witnesses. Section 5, Textual Anomalies Summary. So we've been through a lot of things in this last section, and I want to go through it just briefly so we've got an overview. So the first thing we looked at in chapter 1 was ether. And ether is a repetition. It's a story arc that's the same as the Book of Mormon, and it covers the same ground, and we showed that it also had the same phraseology, which shouldn't be the case because they're at least 1,500 years apart. But that you could pretty much make up the Book of Ether with passages from the Book of Mormon. Chapter 2, we talked about ether repetitions because there's a number of story arcs in ether that are repeated again and again. And so just using those, it manages to fill the space. Chapter 3 is recurrence of stories, and there are a number of stories in the Book of Mormon which are the same. They follow the same story arc, they have the same kind of characters, they have the same phrases, the same wording, and so they are basically the same story, just in a different part of the Book of Mormon, and they read sometimes word for word. Chapter 4 is about repeated type scenes, so these are smaller story arcs that are used again and again to flesh out larger stories. Chapter 5, we talked about repeated text, so a number of places where the same phrase is used again and again, even in the same verse, showing that it's an oratory production, and so you're getting these same ideas in your head and reframing them, something that wouldn't happen if it was a written down text. Chapter 6 was about the record being constrained, and that there's lots of omissions in the text that suggest that there's all of this information which is missing, which seems crazy because there's all of this repetition where things are doubled up. Then there's this textual redundancy where, in a matter of spacing, there's a lot of incoherent rambling, which also is an indication of oratory production. Chapter 8 was about general redundancy, that we see these 19th century phrases in the Book of Mormon again and again, and how we can track that through modern analysis of books from the 19th century. Chapter 9, we talked about repeated names in the Book of Mormon, that there's a number of core names and then some add-ons, and so the sophistication that the Book of Mormon seems to have with names is not quite so sophisticated. Chapter 10, we looked at odd contradictions, so places where the Book of Mormon said that it should be a particular way, and then we find that the Book of Mormon is the exact opposite way in another part. Chapter 11, there are lots of corrections within the text, so as an oratory production, they're being corrected as they're being spoken. And lastly, chapter 12, how the scribes of the Book of Mormon end up influencing the text of the Book of Mormon, which shouldn't really be happening, but it's understandable if you understand Joseph is drawing from them.